Okay, so Alberto here wanted to talk about books. And the first book I remember reading that was not fiction, my first self-help book, was Jeffrey Gitomer's Little Red Book of Sales or Selling. And I read this because my drummer in college talked me into getting a sales job, and I fell in love with sales and I wanted to be the best at it. And so because of that obsession, I started naturally reading. And I ended up reading like all of Jeffrey Gitomer's books. He has like a second red book, he has a green book of Getting Your Way, black book of networking, like all sorts of stuff. And that made me eventually win a promotion from the company I was working for, and they moved me into sales management. But unfortunately, I didn't read any books on sales management, so I was not ready. And a year and a half later, I ultimately failed kind of and ended up losing my position with the company. And then that led me eventually to the first major book that changed my life and my philosophy on growth. Because at that time I thought that skill sets were static, right? I thought that I was born to be a salesperson and that was all I was ever gonna be. And so I just read a lot of books on sales thinking you can't, like a tiger can't change his stripes, right? So I was homeless at the time. I was at Bank of America talking to a banker about why my account got closed, right? Sadly, right? So the banker says to me though, he's like, I want you to read this book. And he saw that I was in a hard spot. So he gives me this book from the corporate reading list, and they've got all the books on the wall, right? They've got 8 books on the wall, and this is Bank of America's reading list for the year. And so he hands me this book, he says, bring it back, maybe, because he knew I was in bringing it back. He's like, but this book was helpful for me, and it was called The Leadership Pipeline. And that book talks about this phenomenon where individual contributors, like a salesperson or an accountant or a videographer, the hardest change they ever go through is being a contributor to being a manager, that leveling up. And so managing other salespeople or accountants is the hardest thing people will ever do. So it made me realize that it wasn't my fault that I failed as a sales manager, but the company that I worked for, they didn't have a growth track for me to become a sales manager, and they just took me and threw me into management when really salespeople, they've got 2 paths. If they're good, yeah, sure, you can move them into management if they're capable of change, but if they're just good salespeople, you should put them on a super salesperson path. And that would have been better suited for me. I could have just been a high-performing salesperson and been happy. But we wouldn't be here because I wouldn't have grown from the failure and learned. So then from there, I realized that if I wanted to learn anything, I could just learn it, because books are like an open window to the inside of an author's brain, kind of. So then I started reading books on management, leadership, on business, on HR. There's a YouTube video on hiring. A guy's name is Armin Trost. He's a German human resources professor, and he puts his courses on YouTube. You're actually sitting in his college dorm, college lecture hall for free. But aside from that YouTube channel, I learned a lot about how I hire from this book called Who. And then I learned a lot after going homeless. I read this book called Brain Steering. It's the art of solving problems by asking questions, because your brain is compelled to answer a question, right? So if I say, what color is the sky? You may not shout blue in your head, but you might imagine a picture of the sky, which then gives you the color blue because you saw it. So if you ask your brain questions, your brain can't help but to answer. So Brain Steering was a great book for me too, because a lot of my creative process now comes from these roots of this book, Brain Steering. One of my favorite leadership books is Multipliers. It talks about this phenomenon where managers can make people better or make them worse. If you ever worked for a really good manager, he makes you feel like you're the best person in the world and you do better work under his leadership. But if you ever worked for a know-it-all, and he knows he's a know-it-all or she knows she's a know-it-all, and they can do anything in the world and they don't actually need you, you can feel that, and they suck the air out of a room and just make you less of a contributor. Multipliers taught me how to better lead people by letting people be the best part of the company. In addition, there's another book, Leaders Eat Last, that talks about making sacrifices for your team, and that leadership is about protecting the people that work for you more than anything else, right? It's not about holding people accountable and scaring them. It's really about creating tight, passionate teams. And then on that learning track thing, the fact that you can really learn anything you set your mind to, I've read a lot of books on cinematography, how to storytell through the camera, which has been fun. I learned a lot about business through a couple audiobooks, and one was Critical Business Skills for Success. The Great Courses does pretty much non-stop educational stuff, and I learned every every little basic detail about business, from finance to manufacturing, some management, some leadership, in that book. It's a broad, very broad 101 style book, and I recommend that. I recommend that one a lot. And of course, there's plenty of other books that I've read, and it's a little crazy that at one point you forget the name of the book, but you still remember the moral of the story. Like, I'm not going to put in like a recommended reading list that you read Think and Grow Rich or How to Win Friends and Influence People, because I think, or 4-Hour Work Week, which I mean, I might actually recommend that book and actually list it because some people haven't read it yet. But there's some books you read, you forget that you read them, but they leave you with this permanent changed philosophy on life. And that is really that's why we should read. Or, I mean, YouTube helps. You can watch YouTube videos. It's like a modern version of reading from an author. Because one of my favorite quotes from one of those books, and it might have been Think and Grow Rich, it might have been somebody else that said it, but the only difference between where you are today and where you'll be a year from now is the people that you meet and the books that you read. That's it. If you want to change, you got to get out there. But really, reading a book is like secondary only to meeting the person yourself, right? So they're kind of the same thing. Other people will influence you to change and become better. And books is one way to meet those people, even if they're in the past, like hundreds of years in the past. So books were huge. Books changed my life. Obviously, I continue to try to make time for reading. And I think, there's some like superficial quotes about CEOs read a book a week and regular people maybe read a book a year. And Tony Robbins says that 90% of people don't get past the first chapter of a book. And he says that in his book, Money, right? As soon as you finish the first chapter of his book, Money, he's like, congratulations, you're in chapter 2. You're in the 10%. So that is one of the biggest stats on wealth, though, is there's a study done, and they look at the 20 differences between people who are impoverished and people who are like the top 1%. And the biggest statistical difference was people who are wealthy, like 83% of people who are wealthy, or maybe it was 91%. Let me look it up. But between 83 and 91% of people who are wealthy read at least a half an hour a day. 99% of people in poverty do not. That's a huge difference. Out of all the other stats, between like good diet, getting enough sleep, single family homes, like all the other statistics, none of them were that big of a difference in the habits of rich and poor people. So even if you just read like Harry Potter books, that's totally cool. It doesn't have to be self-help nonfiction. But the key is to exercise your mind, because your mind gets better and better the more you do something like reading. And Alberto just asked me before we got our food if I'm a fast learner, right? And I said I've mastered the art of learning. And so the daily practice of learning will make you a better learner. So reading, it's a way to attain new information. Your brain is constantly digesting new information. And
do you have any tips on like how to read better and get like the understanding better?
No, I don't actually have tips on how to read better or how to understand better. I think having a wider vocabulary allows you to understand the context of words, and practice makes perfect, right? Reading makes you a better reader because you'll engage a word that you don't know, and you'll learn that word. Like you can Google the word, like be like, hey Siri, what's this word mean, right? And so you expand your vocabulary through reading, and with that expanded vocabulary, you become a better reader. It's a snowball effect, right? So I don't think there's a hack to becoming a better reader aside from the art of practice. Even those courses that claim to make you a faster reader, I'm sure the way to become a faster reader is this guided practice. And that's like anything else. You go to a class to learn how to play guitar. What is it? It's guided practice, right? You apprentice under somebody to be a videographer or a jeweler. It's guided practice. That's what everything is. So reading is practice, and if you go to a course to learn to read faster, that's just guided practice.
Right.
And that's really it.
Cool.
Yeah. So read more. I'm gonna have a salad. Thank you for watching Airbnb Automated, and I'll see you on the other side.